אנו מכריזים בזאת
Hello, this is Barry Shaw of the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, and this is The View from Israel, where I am interviewing certain relevant and important people with regard to the impending ICC investigation of Israel for war crimes. And today I'm particularly delighted to have as special guest Pnina Sharvit Baruch. Pnina, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Pnina, I'm, as I said, delighted to have you on the show because you have been of a critical importance, influence maker in instilling the rules of warfare into the IDF. And I'm interested, how did this symbiosis began between the lawmakers or the people who understand law and the laws of warfare and the officers and the commanders of the IDF? What was the process?
Okay, so I was in the International Law Department. I was there for 20 years, from 1989 until I retired in 2009. We were always involved in giving legal advice to commanders on legal aspects of the IDF activity outside the borders of Israel. There was another department dealing with issues regarding what happens inside the borders of Israel. And that meant a lot of work about, with regard to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip, on all issues pertaining to the also military administration that was there. This is prior even to Oslo, so there was no Palestinian Authority. Including dealing with, when I joined, we were in the Intifada, the first Intifada that started in the end of 1987. So there was a lot of security measures, there was a lot of security tension. So we were giving advice on these issues. We were not really involved in giving advice on laws of armed conflict. So let's say in the first Lebanon war, that was before my time in the department, but the department was involved only with regard maybe to detention, to certain specific measures, but it was not giving legal advice on the laws of armed conflict, on the operations themselves during that war. What happened was that when what is called the second Intifada, which wasn't an Intifada, it was a wave of very terrible terror attacks that started in the end of 2000, we were giving still legal advice to the commanders on how to use all kinds of security measures. But at one stage, the commanders came and said, look, this is not a law enforcement situation. The measures that you use to quell disturbances and to arrest people are just not suitable. We are confronting an organized armed groups operating from areas where the IDF is not operating. That they have a lot of weapons and explosives, and they're very well organized. And the seriousness of the attacks was that we had hundreds of casualties on the Israeli side. We think this requires us to use a force that is more what we would use in an armed conflict situation. This is how we evaluate the situation. And we had to examine the situation and say whether legally we can really apply the laws of armed conflict to the situation. And when we examined it and we looked at what we could find also in the literature, we said, yes, this is a situation that has all the characteristics of an armed conflict. Yes, there's not a state on the other side, but a non-state actor, but that shouldn't be that's not the defining criteria. And then we started applying the framework of armed conflict to the activities of the IDF and started giving the legal advice based on the laws of armed conflict. And that's how it started, that the commanders got used to us being there, and then we started consulting them also on the laws of armed conflict. With time, it developed. We developed a whole operational legal advisors unit that would give legal advice to commanders in any kind of operation or war, including, let's say, the Second Lebanon War and all the operations in Gaza, but also are there during drills and during the preparation of operational plans, operational commands. So we have become entrenched, the legal advisors have become entrenched and working with the operations command and with the commands themselves from the beginning of the process. We are there involved, making sure that all the operational plans and the operational commands incorporate the legal aspects that are relevant to applying force. And the legal advisors are part of the decision-making process, also during high-level operations. And then we have someone there 24/7. We have shifts. There's always will be a legal advisor that can be asked, and will give his or her opinion on the legality of any kind of act. Also on general practices, but also with regard to specific operations and specific attacks.
You know, this is fascinating, and I want to go more into it, but something that you said triggered something in me, Pnina. I want to go off track just a little bit, because we're talking about our army having to tackle, for decades, multiple and major terror attacks against Israel by all forms. And I'm going back to suicide bombers. I don't know if you know this, but I became the co-founder of the Netanya Terror Victims Organization after my hometown of Netanya had a spate of Palestinian terror attacks, including many suicide bombers. And what we found since, that when we wanted to get representation, legal representation for our terror victims, for some sort of reparations, we had to do it through private lawyers based either in Israel or abroad. And I know now there are a number of other terror victims organizations in Israel who are fighting for their terror victims to get some justice for them, having their day in court. And it seems to be done, has to be done privately. And we could never understand why the Israeli government never collated all these horrendous terror attacks and the thousands of victims that have been left in the wake, and go after the Palestinian Authority in a collective manner via the international courts, despite us or some other vehicle, despite the fact that Israel is not a member of the International Criminal Court, even before that. Can you give any explanation of why terror victims, Israeli terror victims, have had to basically go it alone to try and get their day in court, maybe through, for instance, Nitzan Darshner's, the Israel Warfare Center, but why the Israeli government have not really taken it up on behalf of Israeli terror victims?
Well, I don't represent the government, but I think that the government sees maybe looks at things a little bit different, from a different angle, more strategic angle. So it focuses the relations, it focuses its concerns, and it decides how to operate vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority based on more general concerns and interests. And I think one of the understandings, and I think it relates also to now what we have in the ICC, understandings in the Israeli government, is that the legal court system and the judicial systems are not the right place to deal with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. When you go into, when you make it into a legal dilemma, that doesn't solve anything. This is a political conflict. We have to solve it through negotiations, through connections, through force sometimes, when you have to fight terrorists that don't acknowledge the existence of the state of Israel and want us out of here. But that's the way these things are sorted out. You have all kinds of pressure mechanisms. You have things that you give, you have things that you take, and it's not the framework, the relevant framework for the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, or between Israel and the Hamas, is not, I think, the court system.
Right, Pnina. I think this is part of the dilemma that we have here. I think that Israel wants to try and proceed as much as they can to reach some accord, peace accord with the Palestinians, and they would probably feel that if they're highlighting the needs of the Israeli terror victims to international attention, whether it's via the United Nations or some international court or human rights organization, in order to plead the case for the terror victim, they may think that this may adversely affect the Palestinians and prevent them from coming to the negotiation table. I think there's a dilemma there, but I still think that the Israeli terror victims are underrepresented in this debate that's going on. Anyway, I needed to raise that, but it was an interesting point. Let me go back to where we are. You tell us about your involvement in Operation Cast Lead, which led to the Goldstone report.
In Operation Cast Lead, I was the head of the international department, and I was also the head of the operational legal advisors unit that we established. It was just established after the Second Lebanon War, during the Second Lebanon War in 2006. Cast Lead was in the end of 2008, December 2008, January 2009. So we had legal advisors in division level up, in the Southern Command, of course, and in the Headquarters Command. We would give legal advice also on general questions of what kind of practice can be used, what kind of targets, but also on specific operations. In most cases, the commanders themselves already knew the answers. What target is lawful, what is not, how to apply proportionality, because this is something that we've been over with them all the time, also before the operation. But in some cases, there are issues that are more complex, and we provide our legal opinion. Sometimes we have to raise a flag and say, this is problematic, this you cannot do, or you can only do this under these conditions. And I must say that the commanders always accepted our presence, accepted our opinion, and I think saw us as part of the team, because in general, they wished to apply the rules and to act in a way that is lawful. So there was not a conflict of interests, the commanders wishing us out of the room and we insisting on being there. We were part of the team, part of the group. Everybody in the group could raise their concerns. I could also sometimes raise concerns that were not legal, and that was also okay. Raise even concerns of whether this is the right thing strategically, and I could do that too to a certain extent. So everybody can have a say, and the idea eventually is that the commanders and the decision makers want to make the best decisions, taking into account all the relevant factors, the strategic considerations, tactical considerations, security, morality, and law. All these considerations are there.
Are there military lawyers embedded with the commanders in headquarters or even at the attack center? So when the commanders are getting requests to target certain buildings or areas, that there's a lawyer there who would take into consideration the legal aspect of, or is it simply left to the commanders, having had the briefing on the rules of warfare, proportionality, and things like that? Because warfare. Sorry, I just wanted to complete by explaining, of course, that we all know the fog of war. The warfare is a kinetic series of action that changes from second to second. But, when the officers in the field are asking for a question to target a certain building or something, there are certain questions that need to be answered that the commanders sometimes may need legal advice as whether the target is a civilian target or as a civilian target become a military target. So I would imagine on a day-to-day basis, once we have an operation, there is a need for trained lawyers to be there to give advice.
So first of all, the decision eventually is the decision of the commander, not of the legal advisor. We are also not there. I mean, there are no legal advisors under the division level. So you don't have legal advisors in the brigade level, you don't have legal advisors accompanying the forces on the ground. And there the decisions have to be made according to the commands in general, the operational commands that already, as I said before, incorporate the legal aspect into them. So if the soldiers and the commanders on the field are working in applying the commands and applying the logic of the command, they will be applying the law.
Pnina, it seemed at the time of Operation Cast Lead that there was a big volume of noise, and the favorite expression that was littering the media at that time was that Israel had used a disproportionate force in Gaza, leading to the death of thousands of civilians. And I guess this expression of proportionality would come back to haunt us in any current or future conflict that's imposed on us. So, I mean, can you share with us the extent to which our soldiers go to avoid civilian casualties? And can you explain also the concept of proportionality in warfare?
Yes, I think there's a lot of misconception about what the laws of armed conflict or IHL, what they demand. One major one that I hear is that there is an obligation to no civilian casualties, that almost any civilian casualty means that something went wrong or something unlawful was done. I remember I was once in a panel in San Remo with international law experts from all around the world, and on the panel we were talking about precautions, but with me was the legal advisor of NATO, and the heading of his presentation was that there is no requirement for zero civilian casualties. So that's what he was explaining to the crowd. It was something that I think shows what basic misunderstanding there is. So first we must understand the law itself. And I think before proportionality, what we have to start with is distinction, because part of the problem starts there. The first principle of the laws of armed conflict is that you are allowed to target combatants, civilians that are directly participating in hostilities, and you are not allowed to direct attacks against civilians, and that you are allowed to target military objectives, and that you are forbidden. It is forbidden to target civilian objects. But what needs to be understood is that who is a civilian and who is a combatant depends on the situation. So a civilian, as I said, that is directly participating in hostilities, or a member of an organized armed group, even if he's wearing civilian clothes, can still be a lawful attack if he's part of the armed forces of the other side. And with regard to objects, and this is even more crucial, a civilian object that is used, for example, for military actions of the other side loses its civilian nature and becomes a lawful attack. That's a lawful target, for attack. That's the laws of armed conflict. I'm not inventing anything. These are the laws that all the militaries apply, the militaries that abide by the law. That's why even if after the fact one comes to the Gaza Strip and sees civilian homes that have been destroyed, schools that have been hit, even clinics or mosques, and if the conclusion is Israel is targeting civilian objects, that's not necessarily the right conclusion, because if, and that is the situation, since schools and mosques and clinics and homes and private homes are used by the other side for storing ammunition, as headquarters, for launching attacks, then they lose their civilian protection and they become lawful targets. So first of all these are not civilians and are not civilian targets. Then when we look at proportionality, so the proportionality rule says that it is a balancing process. There's no requirement that you avoid any civilian casualty. What has to be done is to balance between the military advantage anticipated from the attack and the civilian harm, what is called the collateral damage that is expected from the attack. And then the commander has to balance. And only if the civilian harm, the harm to civilians and civilian objects is excessive, in relation to the anticipated military advantage, then the attack will be considered disproportionate and not legal. That means that you can carry out an attack even if you know that civilians might be harmed, even killed, and it still could be a lawful attack if the military advantage sought is a high military advantage. And one example is, for example, in the Second Lebanon War, in the initial stages of the attack, Israel had very good intelligence on the location of the long-range missiles that were strategic capability that Hezbollah had that could reach all parts of Israel, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And they were all stored in civilian homes. So the military advantage was huge. The civilian cost was also severe, or it was also serious, but they decided that in many cases this still meets the proportionality requirement and went ahead with these attacks. And in some cases, they said, no, this is too many civilians might be harmed, so it doesn't meet proportionality. And in some places, they did not attack. So this is an example where you know that civilians might be killed and it is still lawful to attack. In other cases, also, the civilians might be, or the civilian casualties might be a result of a mistake. It can be mistaken intelligence. This is the famous case of Shahade, which was a targeted attack against the head of the military wing of the Hamas. And there was a shed next to his home. It wasn't a house, it was a shed. The intelligence thought there was nobody there, and there were civilians there, and 14 civilians were killed. This was a mistake in intelligence. But then, again, we have to remember that the rule is that you have to balance between the expected military advantage and the expected or anticipated collateral damage at the time of the decision, based on what the commander making the decision knew or could know at the time, not without the benefit of hindsight. You don't judge proportionality according to the result. And in other cases, the mistake can be a flawed execution of an attack, that you miss the target, for example. These things happen, and sometimes I meet people that have this unrealistic, I would say almost romantic notion that the IDF can make no mistake. So if something happened and we say it was a mistake, they don't believe us, because how can the IDF, with all its capabilities, make a mistake? But yes, we do make mistakes, as other militaries do too. The US, Germany, and other NATO forces, and the UK all make sometimes mistakes. So we have to take all that into consideration. But on the public arena, and when we talk about lawfare, when we look at legitimacy, unfortunately, these considerations are not taken into account.
You know, it's interesting what you said there, because there's also the human face of this. There was an excellent article written in the Jerusalem Post by the editor Yaakov Katz, in which you were featured, Pnina. But there was a certain anecdote given there of Brigadier General Zvika Fogel, who was the head of the attack center, and he was receiving requests to target certain buildings. And this is where, in the fog of war and the kinetic action that goes on, there was a particular building that was a civilian building that had been taken over by the enemy, and the troops on the ground were asking permission to target it and to strike. And the request came to Zvika Fogel, and he then gave the permission to the commanders to actually target that building. And it was targeted by a tank, and the building was destroyed, only to be discovered afterwards in the kinetic movement of fog of war that, in fact, the building had been taken over by the local soldiers on the ground, and the house had been occupied, was now occupied at that time by Israeli soldiers. 3 were killed, 24 were injured by an Israeli tank shell, one of which was Brigadier General Fogel's son. This is what happens in wartime. But I would assume, if I want to be tragically cynical, I suppose the Palestinian Authority, or maybe even the International Criminal Court, would consider Israel guilty of war crimes by actually killing and injuring their own soldiers. This is what happens when you have a kinetic action on a battlefront. But this leads me to another question, Pnina, of what you said. Our civilian building becomes a military target. If a civilian building has been taken over by Hamas, by the enemy, in order to use it either to booby trap or to target or to shoot at our soldiers, that, I would assume, has become a military target. And therefore, it would be legitimate for Israel to target it. But it raises another question. If this is one of the claims that are being brought against the IDF by the International Criminal Court as part of the complaint by the Palestinian Authority, surely a rebuttal of that is that not only we prove that it was in fact a legitimate military target, but that in fact that this is evidence that Hamas, the Palestinian Hamas, was in fact committing a war crime against their own building by using a civilian property, and in certain cases in Gaza, as you quite rightly clear, including a hospital, as a military position in which to fire rockets at Israeli civilians and to shoot at Israeli soldiers, knowing that they will not deliberately shoot at a hospital or something like that. So basically, evidence given by the Palestinian Authority against us could actually go back and actually be a proof of war crimes committed by the Palestinians against us.
Theoretically, you're right, but practically, it's very difficult to prove. That's one of the problems. One of the problems is that it is very difficult to prove after the fact that a certain civilian building was indeed used for military purposes. The people who are firing the rockets are not there. The rockets are not there. If the building was destroyed, it's difficult to find evidence. And you will not find many witnesses on the Palestinian side that will acknowledge that indeed the building was used for operating by the Hamas, for example, against the IDF. And this is actually a very notable point because, for example, in the Commission of Inquiry that was nominated by the Human Rights Council during Protective Edge, but it wrote its report after Protective Edge, and I analyzed this report. This is one of the main problems. They came and spoke to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and it's written in the report that all the interviews that they made with Palestinians were accompanied by members of the Hamas government, representatives that were sitting there in the room, and they even write that clearly the people couldn't speak freely. But then this doesn't disturb or doesn't prevent the COI from using these statements. So of course, in all these statements, the Palestinians said that the building was not used at all by the Hamas operatives or by the Hamas for anything, and then suddenly Israel attacked it with no reason. So while they acknowledge that people would clearly not say anything against the Hamas or against the Hamas interests in the presence of the Hamas people there, they still base their conclusions on these testimonies. So they say, we didn't find any proof that the Hamas was really using these buildings, for example, a home or a school or whatever, for a military, for any kind of military activity. And it was claimed that it wasn't used so Israel, when it attacked it, was attacking a civilian object. So it's not that it's only difficult to prove. Also, the evidence that is given is on the opposite. It goes to the opposite direction. And these reports, this report of the COI, of the Commission for Inquiry, and of other NGOs, these are the reports that are the basis for the conclusions of the prosecutor of the ICC. In the preliminary examination phase, it bases itself on open sources and on these kinds of reports. So I find it quite worrying that this forms the basis for conclusions that even there even prima facie they might have been war crimes there if they are based on these kinds of testimonies.
The Goldstone investigation really derived not from a law court, but from the United Nations Human Rights Council. And it was led by Goldstone on the premise that Israel had, in fact, deliberately targeted civilians. But at the end, after he produced his report, he made a very strange statement saying that if I had known then what I know now, the document would have been completely different. Can you throw some light on that statement? What happened to him after the report, after Israel had been damaged by the result of that report?
I think the Goldstone report was really, I took it personally because I was the legal advisor in Castled. I was even blamed after the fact of assisting the IDF in carrying out war crimes. Also based on the Goldstone report. And I think that it first of all reflects the problem that I said beforehand, but it also reflects a problem that we have with the staffing of those preparing these reports. And the UN system, especially the UN Human Rights Council and all the rapporteurs and commissions of inquiry that are appointed by it are staffed by many people that have agendas, have links to the Palestinians in many cases. And I think those were the ones that prepared the report, in fact. Goldstone probably didn't write it himself. And I think maybe he understood that he was misled by them, that they led him to a certain conclusion, which was very wrong. I mean, it was really serious because he said, he didn't even say Israel acted, the report didn't say that Israel acted disproportionately or made many mistakes. It really said that Israel had a policy of attacking civilians, of carrying out war crimes. This is a very, very serious allegation, a baseless allegation. I can say here from my personal knowledge, totally baseless allegation. The last thing Israel was doing was purposefully attacking civilians. A lot of effort was done not to attack civilians, to spare the civilians, with a proportionality analysis, with precautions that were taken and warnings that were given. So this was clearly wrong, to say the least. And I think Goldstone maybe later understood that he was misled, that they took him on a certain route to reach this conclusion that was wrong, and maybe he was sorry for falling into this trap.
Yes, this is clearly one of the issues that most of us here in Israel and a lot of our friends abroad knew about at the time, that this was a politically biased investigation. And I'd like to add also that many of us believe that the current ICC pending investigation of Israel for war crimes is an equally biased one. There's a feeling that the ICC do the bidding of the United Nations anyway, which has a permanent anti-Israel agenda, Article 7, on its Human Rights Committee. And it's receiving the plaintiff is the Palestinian Authority, which, although the ICC sees it as a state, many of us see it as a terror inciting, terror rewarding entity. And not a state, and yet the ICC are taking a brief or a plaintiff from the Palestinians against us. Let me add, before I come on to the question, to one of the hypocrisies that I see, that the Palestinian Authority is a member of the ICC, Israel is not, and they claim to be bringing this case against Israel on behalf of the Palestinians, and yet they did not bring any case to the International Criminal Court when Assad of Syria was barrel bombing the Palestinians in the Yarmouk refugee camp, where an estimated 3,000 Palestinians were killed by Assad and also the International Criminal Court has taken no action against, for instance, our neighbors and others who are clearly guilty of war crimes against their own people and other people as well. They ignore that, but they take up a Palestinian claim against Israel, and the Palestinians themselves didn't add the genocide that Assad committed against the Palestinians and his own people in Syria. The sheer hypocrisy and the double standards speak for itself, but I don't know if you want to address this.
Well, I have a lot of criticism against the court, and yes, it's political bias that I think we can see in certain decisions, especially in the case of Israel. But I must clarify that the court doesn't have jurisdiction over Syria, so it cannot really open an examination or an investigation with regard to Syria, or with regard to Iraq, or with regard to other states that are not party to the conflict, except with regard maybe to war crimes carried out by members by citizens of states that are parties. That's why the UK there was an examination about the UK forces operating in Iraq, because the UK is a party to the ICC statute, to the Rome Statute, but Syria is not, Iraq is not, other areas in the world that also, China and others, you can also think of other cases. And since they are not members of the ICC, it does not have jurisdiction there. The only way to get jurisdiction is through a Security Council resolution, a UN Security Council resolution. And here there were attempts to get such a resolution, but Russia and China, for example, did not or prevented any attempt to have a successful resolution that will, for example, open an investigation into Syria. I think also there was not so much pressure from the other countries, because in Syria, if there was an investigation or an examination, a process examining the situation in Syria, it would apply also to the coalition forces, to anybody operating in Syria. And I think states are hesitant, because the court has made them hesitant, to allow investigations into their operations as well. Because if Israel is blamed of war crimes in Gaza, in Operation Protective Edge, then the same kinds of allegations can be made to all the coalition forces that operated against Daesh in Syria. We use the same legal framework, the same kind of strategies, the same kind of tactics. When I was still in the IDF, I had many meetings with my colleagues from military legal advisors in militaries that in NATO countries, for example, and we had the same kinds of dilemmas. We applied the same kinds of standards. So I think that's another reason why any kind of investigation on IDF activity should and will be of concern to other states that are members of the court, because if Israel is being investigated for these kinds of actions, so could and would their forces, and they are members. So I think that's another reason why states are hesitant to accord jurisdiction to the ICC in any cases that they might be involved in, because there's a bit of, unfortunately, mistrust about the professionality of this body and its impartiality.
Well, Pnina, I'm glad you mentioned jurisdiction, and I assume you're saying that because Syria is not a member of the ICC, so that ICC doesn't have jurisdiction to investigate them. So again, it points to another hypocrisy, because Israel is not a member of the ICC, but the ICC is investigating Israel. And recently, as we know, that Israel made a decision after a high-level meeting not to cooperate with the ICC. And one of the reasons was given by Attorney General Mandelblit, who claimed that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over Israel. And I think he also added the fact that this jurisdiction ended simply because Israel adequately investigates any war crimes or any misbehavior of any of our troops in the IDF. And so therefore this is covered also, doubly so, by ICC rules and guidelines. This, of course, doesn't apply to Syria because Assad has never investigated his soldiers for war crimes over there in Syria. How do you respond to that?
So with regard to jurisdiction, the main claim, I think Israel has a very solid legal claim, is that the court lacks jurisdiction in our case because the jurisdiction is based on the fact that the state of Palestine, I'm putting here, a state of Palestine has given the court jurisdiction and also joined the Rome Statute and given it jurisdiction to examine all war crimes from the 13th of June 2014. So they base their jurisdiction in our case on the fact that Palestine is a member of the court. In short, what Israel claims, and I think rightfully, is that there's no such thing as a state of Palestine. There's no existing state of Palestine. And also that there's a big question mark about, even if we accepted that as a state, let's say, for the sake of the argument, what is the territory of this state? And the court just took the prosecutor's position that the territory is the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Why? Because the United Nations, General Assembly, and other political bodies and political and states acknowledge that the Palestinians have a right to self-determination in these territories. And that's a very weak basis to say that there's a state of Palestine in these territories. And beyond that, the court, the prosecutor, and then the pretrial chamber, the majority judges there, I must say that the minority did not accept this position at all, said that they also disregarded completely the fact that the Palestinian Authority, even if we say that it is a Palestine, that it is a state, its jurisdiction, its criminal jurisdiction is limited under the agreements that created it, the Oslo agreements, to cover only areas A and B, that are the parts of the West Bank that are under its control, mainly the populated by Palestinians, and the Gaza Strip, and only with regard to Palestinians. So they don't have any criminal jurisdiction outside in Area C, for example, where the settlements are. In East Jerusalem, of course, because the Oslo agreement didn't apply at all to East Jerusalem, and they don't have any criminal jurisdiction over Israelis. So what the court and what the prosecutor are doing here is they are actually deviating completely from the basic principle of the court, that this is a court that the jurisdiction of the ICC is based on the fact that the states that are members to the ICC are giving it their jurisdiction. They are allowing it to enter into their shoes. But here they just disregarded the fact that the Palestine is giving them a jurisdiction that it doesn't have. And that's the minority points that out, the minority judge, the president of the court, Judge Kovac. So I think they got it completely wrong on jurisdiction. And that's why also Israel is not going to cooperate, because it doesn't accept that they have any jurisdiction in this case. Beyond that, what you were talking about is that there's also another good argument, which is the argument of complementarity. Because the court is only supposed to deal with cases that are not being investigated by the relevant state itself. And Israel has investigated any claim. I just checked again the site, the website of the Military Advocate General's unit. There's a list there of all the investigations and examinations that were opened with regard, for example, to protective edge. They examined hundreds of cases. Every allegation that was made by whoever, Palestinian, an NGO, the press, was examined, was investigated thoroughly. So we have in place our investigations in Israel, and therefore, under the complementarity principle, the court lacks jurisdiction examine these cases. So that's another argument that we have, at least when it comes with regard to IDF activity. There's another. The ICC is also examining the issue of settlements. There, the issue of complementarity is less relevant because Israel does not view the settlements as a war crime that it will investigate.
I think you've raised some very important and interesting points there. And I think many of those points have not been taken into consideration by some of the influential people that will be watching this video. I think that's very interesting. To conclude, we have a situation where we have the International Criminal Court intending to continue with the war crimes investigations over here. And we have the Israeli government who have decided now not to cooperate with the ICC. We also have the clock is ticking on the special prosecutor, Fatah Bensouda, who finishes her term in office in June. How do you see what's going to happen going forward in the near future? How do you think this is going to play out, Pnina?
The prosecutor in 2019, in December, when she asked the pretrial chamber for its to give its assessment of the issue of jurisdiction, she wanted and she asked for certainty. She said that since the jurisdiction is a complex issue, I want to know that the court accepts my position that I have jurisdiction. She didn't really get what she wanted, because what the pretrial chamber, again, in the majority, there were two that said yes, one a minority view, but the majority there, what they said we accept that there is jurisdiction and as I said, on all the territories, but only for this stage of opening an investigation. And they said specifically, it doesn't mean that in the future we will not re-evaluate the issue of jurisdiction. If it is raised by anyone, for example, that is being summoned or by a relevant state, we can re-examine the issue of jurisdiction. So they didn't give a final answer. And in my view, this opens the way to the new prosecutor, who will enter in June, to reevaluate the issue of jurisdiction. As I said, I think Israel has very good arguments why there is no jurisdiction. I think the argument why there is jurisdiction is very weak. The judges also in the pretrial chamber are changing, and the president is staying there, the one that was in the minority. So I think that there is still a possibility that this determination that there is jurisdiction will be reevaluated, again, because I think it's really a weak basis for this conclusion. And also the next prosecutor will have to determine, will have to do prioritize which cases to go ahead with. There was a report actually headed by a committee headed by Richard Goldstone, but it was a professional body that examined the ICC with a lot of criticism about the way the ICC has been operating since its establishment, including the fact that it is very inefficient and that it has to prioritize better. And I think when doing the priorities, I'm not sure that our case, which is very complicated, rests on a very shaky basis and is generally complicated, why that one should be given precedence. And maybe the new prosecutor will also think that it is better to stick to the cases that really refer to the blatant war crimes that are occurring and that have a stronger basis. So there's still a chance, I think, that this case will go back to where it should be, the political realm, and not the ICC.
Well, Pnina, I think this has been a pivotal interview in our series we're running on the ICC actions against Israel. I want to thank you, Pnina, for participating in it, and thank you for your time. I have a feeling, Pnina, that we'll be needing to interview you again in probably sometime after June on the issue as it carries forward. But I want to thank you for your time for this interview. It's been tremendously valuable. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is Barry Shaw from Israel Institute of Strategic Studies on The View from Israel, saying thank you for watching, and please contribute and share this video to others so that they will learn from what we have to offer. Thank you very much for joining us.
אנו מכריזים בזאת